right, so firstly, as Ingrid said, my name is Paul Jacobson. I also call myself a digital risk strategist. My focus is digital risk. I specialize in social media and digital marketing and the risk issues around there. And the reason why that is somewhat relevant is that I am almost entirely digital. I have one little paper thing. You'll see, I've got a photo for you just now, but I generally work digitally. Like Arthur, I go to an event and I don't take the paper handouts. It drives me crazy when people give it to me. Because all that's going to happen is I'm going to bring it back to my office and I'm going to scan it. It's going to be a bigger file size. It's not going to be as good resolution as if I actually got the digital version. I don't like dealing with paper. Lately I won't actually take the handout. If it isn't in digital format, I won't take it. Because it just means that it's got to go into my workflow and it's going to add extra work for me. As it is, I've got a pile of stuff I've got to process still at my office. Okay. All right. So, as you might expect, I haven't actually relied on paper files in my office for a while. And why is this vaguely interesting? Is because before I started calling myself a digital risk strategist, I actually practiced as an attorney. I still am an attorney, I just don't practice so much as an attorney. And it may surprise you, but attorneys have a fetish for paper. They do. You wouldn't notice. You wouldn't think to see. So we have a thing for paper. I mean, I remember back in the day, and back in the day was maybe, I don't know, almost a decade ago, or just under a decade ago. A typical file, a case file in work that I was involved in, and back then my emphasis was more on litigation, so it wasn't uncommon to have a file that was literally this size. The challenge was finding something that I could use instead of an elastic band to keep the file closed. And you get these straps and adjustable straps with Velcro and just, elasticized straps and things just to hold these things in place, and that was a small matter. As Ingrid pointed out, you've seen some of the paper that's going on in the Oscar trial. That's not, granted it's a big case, but that type of paper is not unusual. And I made a decision a while ago to move away from paper files and start digitizing the stuff. All right, so here goes. Here's the legal stuff, which I'm sure is why you're all here. All right, so an act was passed in came into effect in about 2002. It's called the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act. This quote from the Act is one of the almost founding principles of the whole thing. It's what signified the change from before the ECT Act to where we are at the moment. And it's this basic idea of parity between data and paper. Okay, so like I said again, parity between data and paper. There are some exceptions depending on the kinds of work that you're doing, but a digital representation of this is the same as a paper printout of this. That's the idea. Now it references a data message, so this is what a data message is defined as in the ECT Act. And what I like about the ECT Act is that it's fairly technology neutral. So we're not talking about specific formats, specific types of technologies. It's designed to be a kind of future-proof thing. As long as we have data that has these kinds of characteristics, it's going to fall under the scope of this. And this is the right kind of practice. So even when you're looking at things like policy frameworks and that internally, especially with social and digital, you don't want to be too platform specific or too technology specific, because your frameworks are going to be outdated very quickly. But this is basically what a data message is. And if you look at what the definition is and you think about it, it basically applies to virtually everything you do in the digital space. Now, we know about this thing called things being in writing. You often see it, references to it in documents, that things have to be in writing. So when there's and this is where you start having some of the differences between how you operate under the ECT Act and how you do, say, in paper, is that where there's a requirement, so a legal requirement, so a law says such and such has to actually be in writing, you have this idea of an advanced electronic signature. Electronic signatures are what the ECT Act basically calls, what most of us think about as digital signatures. So, yeah, okay, so you read the slide, but that introduces one of the issues. So this whole idea of something being in writing is that if it's typed and it's on a screen, that's in writing. Now, okay, so that's important for another reason. I mean, how many of you have looked at a contract which says that you can't change the contract unless the parties agree to it and they put it in writing? And then what happens if you send an email to someone saying, hey, you know what, instead of us paying you like R1 million for this thing, how about we just pay you, 900,000 Rand for the thing? And the guy thinks, oh, okay, yeah, whatever, I'll humor you. And he says, fine, and he emails you back. You've now varied the terms of your contract in writing. So maybe it's not email. Maybe you have a WhatsApp conversation. Maybe you have you DM each other on Twitter or something. That's all in writing. Those are all data messages. It opens up that scope now so much to all of it. Because before, if you're going to change something in writing, you actually have to print out the thing. You have to sit down and both sign the thing. There's that very sort of immediate physical thing. But now with digital, it's changed. So electronic signatures. This is basically the definition of what an electronic signature is. An electronic signature can be an actual digital signature that you apply using Adobe Acrobat or something. It can be your email signature. It can be some sort of identifier that it identifies who you are, coupled with this this indication of approval. So you can have, that's what I say, you can have an email. I can send you an email and say, hey, so-and-so, how about I buy your pen for 10 Rand, and you email me back and you say, fine, and at the bottom of your email is your name and your maybe some contact details. We have now entered into a written contract which we have both signed. It doesn't have to be the kind of digital signatures that we think about, although those have other benefits. Because with that, you introduce greater, more indications about identity and authentication and that sort of thing. I mean, if you think about a contract, when you enter into a contract with somebody on at least a paper-based contract, you come into a room, you presumably know who each other are, you've got the document there in front of you. That document contains the terms and conditions that you propose agreeing on. You sign the document. So when you sign it, what you're doing is you're saying, I, Paul Jacobson, indicate my agreement with these terms and conditions. And the proof of that is my signature. That's why you sign also every page. Because you don't want to have a situation where somebody might slip a page in, for example. So you sign every page, and you're saying, I have marked all of these pages. And because we've been in this room together, we've authenticated each other. You take that digital, now you've got to come up with an analog for that. So digital signatures, as you know, or even if you don't know, digital signatures, what they do is essentially almost like wrap a file in this, trying to think what the word is, but you essentially change the file. You sort of mark the file and say this thing is signed. It is as it stands. And if you make any change to the document, you break the signature. So there are these kinds of analogs, which you don't have necessarily. You don't have this authentication thing. So I talked a little bit earlier about the process of how I contract with my clients. And I say, well, there's sort of an authentication thing, but maybe not so much, because if I know your details, I can fill it into a form and submit it. You're not the one who's actually doing it. So there are still some steps there depending on what you're involved in. So if you're in a kind of industry where you need to have that authentication, you need to have other means to verify that people are who they say they are, because they're still open to that kind of abuse. The one benefit of being in person is that you presumably have a way to verify that. If worse comes to worse, I can say to you, show me your driver's license. Prove to me that you are who you say you are. When it comes to signatures, generally, an ordinary electronic signature is fine. They actually jumped ahead with an earlier one. So except where you have this legal requirement that something be in writing, then you require an advanced electronic signature. Now, the instances where you need that are actually fairly limited. It's usually something like a property transfer or a property transaction, so you can't actually buy and sell a house digitally unless you're using an advanced electronic signature. Wills also, although there was a case that sort of bent that will a little bit, you can't really have a digital will and sign that really. It should have an advanced electronic signature. Also, what's interesting to me is being able to say commission an affidavit, because how much of a pain it is. You have to trek to an attorney's office with your affidavit, or you have to go to the bank or the post office or whatever, wait for somebody to finish, and then sit down with them and then flash your ID and then go through the affidavit and sign it and then go through that whole thing. I'd love to be able to commission stuff digitally, but to do that, you've got to have, firstly, an advanced electronic signature. And with that comes a degree of authentication, which means that then hypothetically, you could sign something on your end, send it through to me. I could verify the signature, and then it is actually yours. Sign it on my end, and then we're done. That's your affidavit done. And we don't have to initial every page. I just apply a signature to the document and finished. But the infrastructure for that is still getting there. There are 2 parties in the country at the moment, I think, who can issue certificates that you can use to create advanced electronic signatures, because there's an accreditation process that's required in the ECT Act. At the moment, there's a company called Law Trust which does it, and also actually the Post Office. The Post Office should have actually done it about a decade ago, but they're apparently finally getting around to doing this now. So you're now covering that, potentially covering that base now, where you can enter into those kinds of transactions. You can have conveyancers now who prepare agreements to transfer land, transfer properties, those kinds of things, assuming that the parties have the right kinds of signatures. There's also this question of original documents. So that also comes up now and then, is that you've got to have the original. But even there, you can satisfy the requirements for an original document if you're using a digital version. I've given you here sort of the basic idea here. You've got this, you need to be able to preserve the integrity of the document. You need to be able to present the information that's displayed there, and then there's a sort of an assessment test for integrity preservation. There's a lot of stuff in the ECT Act about data retention and integrity, and that's actually one of the key things that you need to be thinking about when you're looking at going digital and going paperless or paper-free or what have you. All right, so as I said, the ECT Act also deals with data retention. Now, what's important about this is that, and this is something that's going to affect you, directly, and whenever you're working with this kind of documentation, it's relatively straightforward to scan it and store it, but you need to make sure that you maintain the data's integrity and that you store it properly. Because take a contract, for example. You sign a contract, you scan the contract, and you file it away, and in maybe a year's time or 2 years' time, there's a problem with performance or some kind of issue. And you now need to get into a question of whether you've performed or they've performed or there's been a breach or something, and that contract becomes a key part of your evidence. If you can't prove that you have retained that digital version properly, okay, assuming you don't have the paper version, but if you can't show that you haven't retained it correctly, that you haven't preserved its integrity, its evidentiary value is diminished, if not completely negated. And that kind of defeats the point of scanning it and storing it. You need to be able to have that. Otherwise, you may as well have the paper document, but then there are challenges there as well. So retention is really important. It's not necessarily a very high bar, but there are some things that you need to pay attention to when it comes to data retention and preserving that document's integrity. Okay, we've been talking about paper. There's some disadvantages of paper, obviously, and you're probably aware of a lot of them. For one thing, paper records don't really lend themselves to being backed up. You've got a paper file, it's kind of your version. If something happens to that file, you're stuck. We're not even getting to hard drives that are corrupted. If your paper file disappears, you've got a problem. Another problem also with paper files, and this has become more recently, this has become more of a challenge, is that with your paper files, they're almost always in plain text. So encryption is not really an option with paper. Your version of encryption with paper files is to lock them in a safe or put them into like a locked cupboard or something. That's kind of like your encryption you have with paper files. If you're dealing with really sensitive data, this is becoming more and more important. Never mind government surveillance, and we don't really know the extent of it, but what I've seen so far is scary. And never mind that, it's just being able to preserve the data. How many of you have a USB drive on you right now? How many of you have got potentially sensitive information on that drive and you carry it around with you? Have you encrypted those drives? So if anybody gets them, they've got access to that data. And your company presumably has protocols in place where you talk about what you should or shouldn't carry around with you, and you follow those to the T. Because if you didn't and you lost your drive and you lost that data, there could be a problem. It's not necessarily a redundancy issue. It's more that this is confidential information that you're potentially losing. And this may also surprise you that there's actually a huge market out there for stolen data, sensitive data. It's real. So the key thing with your data is, as you go digital, protect your data. Be aware of things like confidentiality, sensitive information, data protection also. How many of you who carry data on your drives have got personal information relating to maybe other people? Names, phone numbers, addresses, information about those people, anything like that. All right, so I'm doing work for a client at the moment. One of the things that frustrates them is that one of their customers has a habit of delivering vast amounts of personal information on DVDs by courier. And they won't use their secure FTP upload service. They won't use their web-based secure services to upload data. They're delivering DVDs. Wow, that's the next target or the next huge data exploit waiting to happen right there. So here are some suggestions. Firstly, use longer passcodes on your devices. As your devices start to hold a lot of your data or give you access to a lot of your data, you need to secure your devices better. Who doesn't have a passcode on your phone or your tablet? You've all got passcodes, right? Who's using a 4-digit passcode? Sort of the standard one. Actually, I am also. My phone, I use a 4-digit code. Use longer passcodes. Longer passcodes means better protection. It takes longer to get through them. If your device supports it, disable, set a limit on how many attempts you can have. This stops brute force attacks on your device. So somebody can't sit and run some kind of process to try, 10,000 or 1 million combinations on your phone until they open it. I know iPhone does it. I'm sure Android, a lot of the devices do it. It's limited to 4 or 7 or whatever attempts, how many attempts you have. So enable that feature on your devices. This device over here, this is a bit of a punt. I came across this recently. This is it's called a DataSure USB drive. It looks a little weird with the keypad on it, but what that device actually does is when it's locked, all the data on the drive itself is encrypted. It's 256 bits AES encryption, I think it is. And unless you unlock that device, if you plug it into a computer, the computer won't see it. You have to actually unlock it first, then you put it in. The passcodes are a minimum of 7 characters. So the odds of somebody actually cracking that are pretty minimal. And it represents a really interesting way to take your data around with you. So if you're carrying sensitive information, if you work in financial services, you work in healthcare, you work in any of these kinds of industries where that data that you carry is important, but you still have to carry it, this is a really interesting option. There are solutions where you can take a normal drive, which costs a lot less, and you encrypt it with software on your machine. But I'm sure they work fine. I like this one because it's cross-platform. The encryption's on the drive. And you can also actually have sort of an administrator password and a user password, which makes it really interesting if you're sending data somewhere. Anyway, another thing to do is if you're using data storage apps on your devices, like I said here, so things like Dropbox, Evernote, I use both. A lot of these apps have the option of adding a PIN code. So when you open the app, you've got to type in another code just to be able to open the app. Enable that feature as well, because if somebody can open your phone, what else can they access on your device if your phone is open? These are the kinds of, this is the kind of thinking that you need to, these are the kinds of things you need to be thinking about now if you're looking at moving more into a digital space where you have more of your data available through your devices. And I think the benefits of doing it outweigh the cons. You just have to start thinking in a different way. Before this, when you're working with paper, you don't have to worry too much about PIN codes in your paper because there aren't PIN codes in your paper. People weren't really thinking about encryption because you lock it away somewhere. But then you have a fire or a flood or a geyser bursts or something, and then you're stuck. Also, another nice thing about going digital, which anybody who's used Dropbox will probably know this, if you share data with somebody, you can actually revoke it. So that's a really interesting thing there, especially if you've got data you want to share with somebody and you want to be able to control that more effectively. We crack all these jokes about BlackBerry and who uses a BlackBerry. One person sort of hesitantly puts his hand up. But one thing that's really interesting that I'm seeing with BlackBerry at the moment is There's secure, secure workspace, I think they're calling the product, something like that. And this idea of being able to share data with teams, but also have the ability to revoke it. I don't see that in a lot of other genuinely available solutions, at least not the ones that are affordable for most people. But those kinds of things are really interesting. They're really important things, especially if you have a security-conscious business or an organization. So, everybody can, thank you. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope that wasn't too legal and boring. These are my details. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to answer. Otherwise, I'll be around. I'll be around for a bit.
Okay, great.
All right. Thanks very much.